So today you are reading Pauline Hopkins Dash for Liberty, and I just wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the background and setting for the story. Quite obviously, it is set in a time in this country where slavery was still very much a thing, and I wanted to take just a moment to discuss the fact that to us, slavery seems like it is something that happened a very, very long time ago, but in reality it is much more part of our recent history than we like to think. And I don't mean that and that there are still different types of slavery going on in this country, or that institutionalized racism is very much akin to parts of slavery. We all know these things. These are not things we need to debate or things we need to argue about. What I literally mean is that December of 1865, when slavery was finally outlawed in this country, is not nearly as long ago as it seems. When I was a kid and we were learning about slavery in school, it was not unheard of for them to bring the child of a slave in to speak to us. Now, these are obviously very, very old African-American people in the 1980s when I was a kid, but their parents had actually been slaves. And even if they didn't have the stories that their parents told them, because perhaps their parents were very young in 1865 when slavery ended, that would make sense. Their parents might have been too young to really remember things. Their parents got stories from their parents, so they would pass down those stories. There was a very strong oral tradition of slavery, particularly in a time period when people weren't studying slavery or studying the after effects of slavery. So the fact that as a young person in the 1980s, which might seem like a very long time ago to you, but doesn't seem like that long ago to me, I can meet someone that was the child of a slave, it's kind of mind-blowing. There was a popular story when Barack Obama got elected that there was a woman, she was 109 years old, and she was the child of slaves, still alive in 2008, and to vote for Barack Obama to be president. And undoubtedly there are still the grandchildren of slaves around. They're going to be very, very old, most likely. But if you think about it, if someone was a slave and they were, 1, 2, 3 years old in 1865 when slavery ended, and then in their 40s or 50s, so you're talking around 1900, 1910, they had a kid, and then that kid in the 1940s or 1950s had a kid themselves, then we're looking at people that are 70, maybe 80 years old, a little bit younger even, that are the grandchildren of people who were enslaved in this country. And when you look at it that way, it doesn't seem like it was quite so long ago. To that same token, there are undoubtedly people walking around in this country, again, they're going to usually be pretty elderly, who met slaves. I want you to really take a step back and think about that. The next time you run into somebody that is in their late 70s, even in their mid 70s, so you're talking, they would have been alive they would have been born in the 1940s or even the late 1930s. When you meet someone of that age, there's a really good chance that if they had met an elderly African American when they were children, that person might have been a slave or would have been alive during a time where people just like them were slaves. And again, that's really, it kind of closes that gap in time for us. So when we read this story, A Dash for Liberty by Pauline Hopkins, there's a couple things that you have to know. First off, Pauline Hopkins was alive while slavery was still a thing. She was born in 1859, so just a couple of years before the Civil War started. She was a young African American at the time, but she was not a slave. Her family was free. So in 1859, Pauline Hopkins is born. A year or two later, the Civil War starts. About 5 years after that, the Civil War ends, slaves are set free. Pauline Hopkins is still a young child. So she didn't write this story, A Dash for Liberty, during the time that slavery was actually going on. She was looking back in 1901 and writing this story about something that actually happened maybe 15, 20 years before she was born. In the 1840s, there was a ship called the Creole, and there was a slave, Madison Washington, on it, and he led a rebellion and with a handful of other slaves overthrew the ship and freed 100 some odd slaves. So that very closely mirrors the story of our protagonist, Madison Monroe, who is a freed slave, goes back into the United States from Canada to try and free his wife, gets captured, and then leads a revolt on a ship called the Creole, where he gets a small group of slaves together, and they free everyone, including his wife. So Pauline Hopkins is writing this in 1901. 1901 is still a very dangerous time to be an African American in this country, particularly an African American who is outspoken about social issues. Most of her work that she was publishing, and she published quite a bit, was published in the same magazine that you're seeing Dash for Liberty in, and that magazine is called The Colored American magazine, which seems like not something you would want to say today, but that's what the magazine was called back then. So she publishes, and she's publishing to a very specific audience, so she's also telling stories that are ahead of the curve, so to speak. So 1901 in this country, African Americans are starting to find that cultural voice that's about to start to transcend. It's about to cross over into white popular culture with the Harlem Renaissance. And it's a uniquely African American culture that had always existed, but didn't necessarily have the venue or the format to become popular outside of African American communities. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing as far as exploitation and like white tourism would go, that's a topic for another time. But Pauline Hopkins is writing a story that has some resonance in 1901. While you have guys like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois arguing over what the role of an African American should be in this country, and what they or how they should be going about fulfilling that role, here's Pauline Hopkins writing about a rebellion where a black man is actively the aggressor in attacking and attacking and destroying the system run by white men to enslave not just him but his family. So again, Dash for Liberty was published in 1901 in the Colored American magazine. It looks back on slavery that ended in the 1860s and an event, the Rebellion of the Creole, that happened in the 1840s, led in real life by a guy named Madison Washington, led in the story by a character named Madison Monroe. Frederick Douglass actually wrote a fictionalized version of the Rebellion of the Creole, and now Pauline Hopkins is doing the same. And again, Madison Monroe at the beginning of this story, which is, I assume, where most of you are by the time you're listening to this, when the story opens, Madison is a free black man, but he is not a free black man in the United States of America. He's a free black man in Canada, and he's working for a farmer that's paying him, a farmer that is a white man, and it literally, the story begins with a conversation between Madison and this man, Mr. Dixon, and Mr. Dixon seems to be very well-meaning, but he clearly doesn't get the situation. Madison wants to go back and free his wife, and he wants to free the woman that he was married to. And Dixon is repeatedly saying, well, don't I pay you enough? Don't I treat you well? Why not just stay here and be happy instead of going back? And you're free. You're free. You're making money. You live in a nice place. Canada, still a nice place. Why go back? And Madison says to him, well, look, liberty doesn't mean anything to me if my wife's not free too. All right, why can a white man, if someone tries to take his property, and if someone tries to steal a white man's horse, the white man could stand up and shoot him, and he's justified because you were taking his property. But someone can take my wife, a person who I love. Someone can take that person, and I can do nothing because I'm a black man. And there's just still that feeling that Dixon doesn't understand why Madison Monroe feels compelled to do the things that he's doing. And that kind of sets the scene for this whole story. If you're reading it right now, you're seeing that Madison does go back and he finds where his wife is a slave, and he slips in amongst groups of other African American slaves to kind of sneak up to the house, and he gets captured. and he ends up on a slave ship going down to the Caribbean. And in that process, he manages to attack and kill white people that are on the ship that are holding them captive, and then take over the whole ship and free the other slaves and reconcile with his wife. So that's just kind of the whole plot of the story right there. You have to read it to get a little bit of the nuances, and that's what we will be discussing on Tuesday.